Hello again. Today we're talking about the state of the earth and impact of humanity on climate change. The resources for this and the rest of the course are located in your syllabus. One is a book that I found to be very useful, Charlene Hosenfeld, Echo Faith, Creating and Sustaining Congregations. It can be purchased on Amazon, and you can get it at a reduced rate by using used books. You can click on that. The second is a movie that is called Renewal, Stories from American Religious Environmental Movement. And there are 8 vignettes in this that deal with religious response to climate change. It is produced and accessed through Interfaith Power and Light under Resources and Media videos. It is an excellent tool for you to watch, but also weekly they have 8 to 13-minute vignettes that could be used in education and getting folks in your congregation to sit and talk about these. We were very successful here. It's very successful in the classroom, getting folks to talk about how Catholics and evangelicals and Buddhists and Muslims and Jews are responding to climate change and various issues. And it's a good introduction that will generate a lot of conversation. Use them in your congregation as well as for yourself. As I mentioned in the opening, several years ago, I watched with our congregation Inconvenient Truth. And I was very moved by Al Gore's presentation on it. In the 1990s, I taught a course on earth and feminism and earth care at the university I was teaching at. And certainly I was exposed to thinkers like Thomas Berry and Rosemary Ruther and others that were writing in a preliminary way about ecology and environment and the earth. It wasn't until I watched in 2009 a graphic novel, which you can find in its entirety on YouTube, Earth 2100. It traces the life of a young female, Lucy, born in 2009, and ends 2100 with a megastorm that devastates New York City, although we may have seen one of the megastorms in advance with Hurricane Sandy. But I watched it in its entirety, and I became very depressed at the prognosis. But my grandnephew was born 2 days later. And I said, I've got to do something for my nephew. I've got to do something for the students that I'm teaching. I've got to do something for the children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews of our congregants. We cannot have what is proposed in that film happen without really devastating our civilization and bankrupting the earth. It was looking at the fact that climate change will have certain effects. And certainly that impacted me. Sea level rise being one of them. I remember when in the US, with Hurricane Katrina displacing over 300,000 climate refugees, and how much it taxed the resources of the US, and certainly a lot of foundations and charities and churches that contribute to help folks in that crisis. Imagine the possibility of 2 billion climate refugees at the end of this century. It's beyond staggering. To think of Netherlands underwater, New Orleans, a large part of the East Coast, Shanghai with 50 million folks and surrounding the urban population, countries such as Bangladesh and Pakistan and others underwater. When we look at that, we have to say, my God, we're facing a cataclysm that will place incredible stress on the earth and life systems. But it goes even back further and it advances. There are those folks who deny the existence of climate change, and there are folks in our own congregations on a religious basis because they think the earth is going to end anyways with the coming of Christ within the century, and that we don't have to invest in caring for the earth because everything is going to be finished with the coming of Christ. The problem with that kind of thinking is that it is irresponsible. It doesn't address the fact that God cares for the earth and that we have a special relationship with the earth. I try to keep up with the climate science on this, and it's almost a hopeless task because every time I think I have a sense on what's going to happen this century, I get surprised at the revisions. I'll give you an example. I've taken the example that the polar cap, the North Arctic polar cap, will be melted by 2050, and that a good part of the Greenland glaciers will be melted. But then, last week, there was revisions about watch this large glacier in Antarctic. It is on an irreparable collision to fall this century. When we look at the projections about how much carbon we're putting into the air and that what that will do, we're finding that 95% of the scientists keep coming back and saying we're facing things that are going to impact our economy and our lives, and certainly will impact the poor. And I think this is really important. We see increased megastorms. Now, when I was growing up, we certainly had tornadoes and megastorms and hurricanes, but we've never had storms like we've experienced. We have never had devastating fires as we're now experiencing in California, around San Diego and Arizona, and around the world, and how devastating they are. We have extreme weather events taking place consistently, and the American populace is beginning to say, we're no longer naysayers about climate change, it's really happening. When I looked at Earth 2100, I was really challenged to find hope. And that propelled me to start connecting with Earth-based movements. And as I study Earth-based movements, there are approximately 1 million organizations worldwide, and we need to become part of that movement. I believe that faith communities can impact the outcome and severity of climate change on this planet. When I read a study that was also produced on the BBC about the end of life in the oceans, and they were projecting that from studies about 2050, it made me cry. I can't imagine life itself without life in the oceans. When we look at 2.5 billion years ago, life coming from the oceans, it saddens me profoundly to think that this is a possibility. But yet, we have pollution from Fukushima, but we have human pollution of plastics and garbage. And there's an island in the middle of the Pacific the size of Texas. You can go Google it, and you'll find, my God, what we're doing this is destroying the ecosystem and life system of the ocean. Now, there are some naysayers about, Earth 2100. But I have to say that 2 months ago, I showed a follow-up to Inconvenient Truth to a class of mine at CSUN. It's called Chasing Ice. It's a documentary that follows James Ballag, a climatologist, who sets up some 300-400 cameras on the glaciers of Iceland, Greenland, and Alaska. And this is done over a 5-year period. I just showed the documentation from year to year on the progression and receding of glaciers. The visual evidence was compelling to me, but what was even more compelling was when a female student of mine said, Dr. Shore-Goss, climate change is real, isn't it? And I said, yes.